Imagine sitting at a medieval feast table piled high with roasted swan, honey cakes, white bread, and spiced wine, while just outside the castle walls, poor peasants survive on cabbage soup, dark rye bread, and thin ale beside a smoky fire. Tonight, we're stepping into the brutal food divide of the Middle Ages, where every meal revealed your place in society. From noble banquets glowing under candlelight to cold peasant cottages filled with the smell of barley pottage. This journey will take you deep into the forgotten world of medieval hunger and luxury. So before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these immersive medieval stories. Now, settle in, relax, and let's travel back to the Middle Ages together. Hey guys, tonight you find yourself standing beneath the dripping gatehouse of a medieval manor while cold rainwater creeps slowly through the cracks in your boots. The evening bells from a distant monastery roll through the mist like sleepy warnings, and somewhere beyond the walls a dog barks once before deciding the effort is not worth repeating. Smoke hangs low beneath soot-black rafters overhead, mixing with the smell of damp wool, horse sweat, wet straw, and cabbage that has clearly suffered enough already. A stable boy brushes past carrying a lantern that flickers wildly in the wind, and for one brief moment the whole courtyard glows gold against the mud. You quickly learn that medieval travel brochures really oversold this experience. The stones beneath your feet are slick with rain and old grease from cartwheels. A servant mutters while dragging firewood through the slush, and nearby a merchant argues about grain taxes with the sort of exhausted determination that only comes from losing the same argument every week for 20 years. You probably would not last a week out here, honestly. Your modern knees alone would surrender before sunrise. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in tonight, feel free to comment your location and local time as these monastery bells toll somewhere out in the darkness. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The manor gates groan shut behind you with a deep wooden sigh of old oak swollen by rain. Torches hiss in iron brackets along the walls, and servants hurry between buildings with lowered heads, while the weather drizzles steadily into every uncovered sleeve and collar. Ahead rises the great hall itself, its narrow windows glowing amber through the mist like cautious eyes. You step carefully across rushes scattered over the stone threshold. The floor smells faintly of herbs meant to hide older smells beneath them. Lavender if you're lucky, onion skins if you're not. Inside, warmth finally reaches your hands. Not proper warmth, perhaps, but enough to stop your fingers from feeling like small frozen turnips. The hall stretches long beneath blackened beams overhead, and along the walls hang faded banners showing hunting scenes and saints whose expressions suggest they have seen entirely too much nonsense from humanity. At the far end of the chamber, beneath candles made from costly beeswax rather than common tallow, the Lord's table rises on a wooden platform. Even before food appears, rank announces itself clearly here. The benches closest to the hearth belong to favoured guests. Lesser folk sit farther into the draughts. Dogs wait beneath tables with almost religious concentration. No one can quite agree whether dogs in noble halls were considered companions or simply highly organised cleaning equipment. Servants move constantly through the chamber carrying trenchers, linen cloths, pitchers of ale, and bundles of spoons. Forks are rare here and treated with mild suspicion. One old knight near the fire claims that only overly delicate Italians use forks regularly. He says this while wiping grease directly onto his sleeve, which weakens his argument somewhat. You settle quietly onto a bench among travellers, clerks, and minor retainers, Beside you sits an ink-stained scribe warming his hands around mulled ale. His fingers are permanently bent from years copying prayers and tax records by candlelight. He smells faintly of parchment and sheep wool. The hall slowly fills with the sound of hunger. Not loud hunger. Medieval hunger is patient, familiar. It waits quietly inside people like an old tenant who never leaves. At the lower tables, peasants and labourers receive bowls first. Thick pottage steams beneath the torchlight, heavy with barley, onions, leeks, and a few floating beans. A woman tears coarse brown bread into pieces and drops them directly into her bowl to soften. Her hands are red from cold weather and years of work in wet fields. The bread itself tells you almost everything about this world. Dark, dense loaves sit before the common folk like edible bricks. Rye, barley, oat flour, whatever grain survived the season and the weather and the taxes. Some loaves contain bits of husk or ground peas stretched into the dough. One man jokes quietly that the baker added enough straw this year to feed both horse and rider. A few tired laughs answer him. But up at the raised table, servants lay down something entirely different. White bread. Not perfectly white by modern standards, perhaps, but pale enough to shine in candlelight like polished ivory. Fine manchet loaves baked from carefully sifted wheat flour, soft crusts, smooth texture, bread that speaks of land ownership, healthy harvests, and full granaries guarded behind thick walls. You watch a servant carry the loaves carefully as though transporting holy relics. Some swear that noble women prize pale bread because it matched fashionable pale skin, both signs that a person did not labour beneath the sun. Even now, it is hard to tell whether this belief comes from vanity, status, or simply boredom among people wealthy enough to debate bread colour. A bell rings softly from somewhere deeper in the manor. Kitchen servants begin appearing in greater numbers now, flushed from heat and smoke. Their sleeves are dusted with flour. One boy carries roasted chestnuts in a woven basket while another struggles heroically with a pot nearly larger than himself. You catch glimpses through the kitchen doorway whenever it swings open. Cauldrons bubble over massive hearths. Cooks shout over one another. Steam curls upward, blackened by soot. Geese hang plucked beside bundles of herbs. Fish lie salted upon wooden boards. Everywhere there is movement, smoke, heat, and urgency. And hierarchy, because food in this world is never just food. It is rank made visible. The lord eats wheat because he owns the fields. The peasant eats onions because onions survive cold ground and neglect. The monk eats fish because the church demands fasting days so often that people begin inventing entirely new definitions of what counts as fish. Somewhere in France, monks reportedly argued that beavers qualified because they spent time in water. Medieval logic can be wonderfully determined when dinner is involved. At your table, the scribe quietly explains the hall's strange choreography. First come the trenchers, thick stale bread slices used as plates, then soups and pottage for lower tables, then meat for higher ranks, salt placed carefully according to status. Important guests sit above the salt, closer to expensive imported seasoning, lesser folk remain below it. Imagine your entire social worth measured by condiment proximity. The noble table slowly comes alive with silver cups and polished knives. Fur-lined cloaks hang drying near the fire while servants refill wine carefully imported from warmer southern lands. The smell drifting from their dishes changes too, richer, sweeter somehow. Spices, tiny hints of cinnamon, cloves, pepper. You realize suddenly that wealth here is not quiet. It announces itself through scent long before appearance. Even blindfolded, a person could probably tell where the lord sits simply by following the smell of expensive seasoning. Meanwhile, Near the hall entrance, a peasant family shares one bowl among 4 people without complaint. The youngest child falls half asleep against her mother's shoulder while chewing softened bread. Outside, the rain continues tapping steadily against shutters. The fire crackles low. A servant replaces a beeswax candle near the Lord's chair, and the rich honey scent briefly cuts through the smoke-filled air. You notice how carefully every flame is guarded here. Candles are expensive. Firewood must last winter. Even light itself belongs more generously to the wealthy. Those who tell the tale never fully agree whether medieval people accepted these divisions peacefully or simply endured them because there was little else to do. But as you sit listening to bowls scrape empty and distant bells roll through the rain, you begin to understand something important about this world. A meal is never merely a meal. It is survival, status, ritual, weather, faith, fear, and hope served together beside the fire. And tonight, beneath these dark beams and drifting smoke, you are only beginning to taste the difference. Morning arrives slowly through the narrow shutters of the manor guest house, grey and damp and reluctant to begin. You wake beneath a coarse wool blanket while rainwater ticks softly from the eaves outside. Somewhere nearby, a servant coughs with the deep commitment of a man who spent 20 winters inhaling chimney smoke. The straw mattress beneath you has settled unevenly in the night, and your back now feels carefully folded into the shape of a bent horseshoe. The dog from last evening has somehow found you again. It lies near the hearth, one eye open, looking mildly disappointed that you're still alive. Cold air slips beneath the oak door while the first monastery bells echo faintly over the fields. In medieval life, bells are clocks, calendars, warnings, prayers, and public complaints all at once. You begin to understand that people here measure time less by numbers and more by sound. Dawn bells, work bells, meal bells, funeral bells, somewhere, probably, a bell specifically reserved for informing everyone that another goose has escaped. A servant girl enters carrying breakfast loaves in a wicker basket wrapped with linen cloth. Steam curls upward into the dim room. The smell alone nearly convinces you to forgive the mattress. Nearly. You follow the others into a smaller side chamber where lesser guests break their fast before the Lord's household fully rises. Rushes crunch beneath your boots. Smoke drifts lazily beneath black rafters overhead. A pair of merchants sit near the fire muttering about bridge tolls and spoiled grain shipments while rubbing sleep from their eyes. Breakfast in this world is practical before anything else. No towering platters, no delicate pastries dusted with sugar. Medieval mornings begin with survival. The first loaf reaches your hands. It is dark brown, coarse, slightly damp from the morning air, and heavy enough that you briefly consider whether it could also serve defensive military purposes. This is maslin bread, made from mixed grains like rye and wheat together. Common folk rely upon it because pure wheat costs dearly, especially after poor harvests. Some years, bakers stretch flour with peas, beans, chestnuts, or ground oats. Some swear that during especially harsh winters, desperate villagers mixed bark into bread flour. Others insist this is exaggeration invented by monks hoping to frighten wealthy patrons into larger donations. Even now, it is hard to tell where truth ends and hungry storytelling begins. You tear off a piece carefully. The crust resists stubbornly. The inside tastes earthy and sour, dense enough to sit heavily in your stomach for hours. Beside it comes a wedge of hard cheese and a small onion still smelling faintly of soil. The merchants eat without speaking much, hunger first, conversation later. Across the chamber, however, The steward's assistant receives something entirely different. A servant places before him a small white loaf with a polished crust, smoother and finer than anything at the common table. White bread again. Wheat carefully sifted several times to remove darker bran, softer texture, cleaner taste. The contrast feels almost theatrical in the morning light. Poor bread fills the stomach. Rich bread displays control over nature itself. You notice how carefully noble households protect wheat. Granaries are locked with thick iron keys. Millers are watched suspiciously. Bakers can face harsh punishment for cheating flour weights. Bread matters here more than gold some winters. A failed harvest does not merely disappoint people. It reshapes entire villages. The dog wanders beneath benches collecting fallen crumbs with professional dedication. You warm your hands around a cup of thin ale served lukewarm beside the bread. Beer at breakfast sounds alarming at first until you remember the water situation. Medieval wells are uncertain companions. Some are clean. Some contain things no reasonable person wishes to identify before sunrise. Small ale, brewed weekly, becomes safer for daily drinking. Children drink it too. Honestly, after seeing the drainage ditch outside, you begin to understand why. Near the hearth, an old woman slices bread into broth while muttering prayers to St. Honoratus, patron of bakers. She claims loaves blessed on his feast day remain fresh longer. No one argues with her. Medieval people carry superstition the way modern people carry weather apps. Quietly, constantly, just in case. The morning grows busier as servants move through corridors carrying baskets, linen, and kindling. You step outside briefly into the courtyard where mist hangs low over muddy ground. Chickens wander freely with alarming confidence. Stable boys rub down horses beside steaming breath clouds while crows gather atop the gatehouse. From the kitchens drifts the smell of finer breakfast being prepared upstairs. You glimpse trays carried toward private chambers. Soft white bread, honey, preserved pears, warm milk flavoured with herbs, occasionally eggs, though opinions on eggs vary strangely by season and church calendar. One cook insists eggs strengthen the blood during wet weather. Another claims too many eggs invite sinful laziness. Medieval medicine rarely misses opportunities to blame food for personality flaws. You wander toward the bakehouse at the edge of the manor grounds where heat rolls outward in waves against the cold air. Inside, bakers move through clouds of flour dust like ghosts haunting enormous ovens. Dough rests beneath linen cloths. Ash crackles softly beneath brick hearths. A young apprentice explains the difference between loaves while kneading dough with reddened hands. The finest white bread belongs to nobles and wealthy clergy. Then come lighter mixed loaves for merchants and prosperous townsfolk. Dark rye and maslin feed labourers. At the very bottom sit rough breads made during lean years, coarse enough that people soften them in soup to spare worn teeth. You ask whether peasants ever eat fine white bread. The apprentice laughs hard enough to nearly drop his dough. Oh, sometimes, he says finally, at weddings or funerals, if the Lord feels generous, or if mice ruin the good stores first. A practical answer. Outside again, you cross paths with a group of villagers arriving to pay grain taxes. Each carries sacks carefully balanced across shoulders, bent from years in the fields. Their boots leave deep prints in the mud. One man removes his cap respectfully before entering the manor, though his expression suggests respect may not be the emotion involved. The smell of baking follows you everywhere now. Warm grain, wood smoke, damp air. Bread becomes almost alive in your mind as you walk these cold stone paths. It shapes rank, labour, health, trade, even religion. Monasteries own mills. Lords tax ovens. Villagers argue over grazing rights because healthy animals mean manure, and manure means grain, and grain means survival. And yet, despite all this importance, bread also disappears astonishingly fast whenever hungry people gather. By midday, fresh loaves from morning are already reduced to scattered crumbs beneath benches and sticky crusts tucked into sleeves for later. Nothing wastes easily here. Near the chapel wall, you meet the ink-stained scribe again from last night. He carries a small white loaf wrapped carefully in cloth, clearly meant for someone important. He notices your glance and smiles faintly. "Funny thing," he says quietly. "The rich always speak of bread as refinement. The poor speak of it as time." You ask what he means. He lifts the loaf slightly. A soft loaf means fewer hours grinding grain, fewer hours in fields, fewer winters fearing hunger. Then he walks on toward the upper hall while monastery bells ring once more across the wet countryside. The dog follows him hopefully. You remain standing beside the chapel stones for a moment longer, listening to the bells and breathing the smell of fresh bread drifting through the rain-heavy air, beginning to understand that even the simplest loaf in this world carries the full weight of medieval life inside it. By the time the next dawn creeps over the manor fields, the rain has finally loosened its grip on the countryside. Mist drifts low above the wet earth, pale and silver beneath the weak morning light, and every fence post shines with droplets gathered through the night. You leave the manor behind with the same loyal dog trotting several steps ahead, pausing now and then to make certain you are still following his extremely questionable leadership. Your boots sink into muddy cart tracks as you head toward the peasant cottages beyond the Lord's grain fields. Smoke rises slowly from low-thatched roofs, carrying the familiar scent of damp wood, onion broth, and straw beginning to rot beneath winter weather. Somewhere nearby, a rooster crows with the confidence of a creature entirely unaware that people are considering turning him into soup. The fields themselves stretch wide and brown under the pale sky. Stubble from harvested grain still pokes through frozen patches of soil. Here and there, villagers already move through the cold carrying tools over their shoulders, wrapped in wool cloaks patched so many times that the original cloth has become difficult to identify. You quickly notice how different the morning feels away from the manor hall. At the Lord's estate, food arrives carried by servants. Here, every meal begins with labour long before anyone eats. A woman outside one cottage kneels beside a grinding stone, crushing grain steadily with reddened hands while her youngest child sleeps wrapped in wool nearby. The rhythm never stops. Grain into flour, flour into bread, bread into survival. Even before sunrise, breakfast is already exhausting. She nods for you to enter the cottage. Inside, the air feels thick and warm compared to the cold outside. Smoke curls lazily upward through a hole in the roof, though much of it seems perfectly content to remain indoors first. Your eyes sting slightly. Chickens wander beneath the table. Herbs hang drying from blackened rafters alongside strips of onion and garlic. And there, suspended over the fire, hangs the centre of peasant life. The pottage pot. It bubbles gently without ceremony, heavy with barley, cabbage, beans, leeks, and bits of turnip softened through long cooking. Pottage is less a recipe and more an ongoing negotiation with hunger. Ingredients change constantly depending on weather, harvests, luck, and what survived rats during the winter. Some families keep the same pot simmering for days. You lean closer as steam fogs your face. The smell is humble but comforting. Earthy grain, sweet onion, wet herbs, smoke from the hearth settling into everything it touches. A wooden ladle dips deep into the thick broth and fills rough clay bowls one at a time. No delicate silverware here, no polished trenchers, just warm food eaten quickly before work begins again. You taste it carefully. The texture is heavy and uneven, beans softened nearly to paste, chunks of cabbage drifting through thick barley broth. Occasionally a stronger flavour appears unexpectedly, wild garlic perhaps, or an herb gathered from hedgerows before frost arrived. It is simple food, but after the cold road outside, your entire body feels grateful for it. Across from you sits an old labourer with hands shaped permanently around invisible tools. He tears pieces from a coarse rye loaf and drops them directly into his bowl. "Better thick than fancy," he mutters. Then after a pause, "Fancy doesn't help when snow comes." Nobody disagrees. Near the hearth, a grandmother crushes dried herbs into a small pouch while whispering quietly over the bowl of a coughing child. Folk remedies live comfortably beside religion here. Sage for fevers, honey for sore throats, garlic against sickness, charms stitched into clothing against wandering spirits. No one can quite agree whether the charms work, but nearly everyone owns one anyway. The grandmother notices you watching and explains solemnly that onions hung beside the bed absorb illness during the night. Whether they actually cure disease or merely make the room smell aggressively of onion remains difficult to determine. Breakfast continues slowly. The family eats without waste. Even crumbs are gathered carefully. One child scrapes the last grains of pottage from the bowl with a finger before licking it clean. Hunger never stands very far from these cottages. You feel its quiet presence in the room like another unseen guest beside the fire. And yet there is laughter too. A man enters carrying turnips from storage and complains that one resembles the village priest so closely he now feels guilty about boiling it. The room erupts in tired amusement. Medieval humour, you discover, survives remarkably well on vegetables and shared misery. Outside, bells drift faintly across the fields again. Work soon resumes. You follow several villagers toward the communal bake-oven near the centre of the settlement. Women arrive carrying dough wrapped in cloth while children trail behind half awake. The oven itself radiates fierce heat against the cold morning air. Bread-baking days become social gatherings as much as chores. People exchange gossip while waiting their turn. Someone mentions a nearby village where wolves supposedly carried off an entire ham through an open window last winter. Another insists monks at a distant abbey brew ale strong enough to cure sadness and possibly blindness. Those who tell the tale never fully agree on details, though the monk's popularity appears unaffected. A baker removes finished loaves with a wooden paddle blackened by years of use. Dark crusts crack softly in the cold air. The smell alone draws half the village closer. Again you notice the difference between these loaves and those inside the manor. The bread here is uneven, rough, practical. Some are flat. Some split strangely during baking. One contains visible oats because wheat stores ran low weeks ago, yet every loaf represents hours of labour ploughing, sowing, harvesting, grinding, kneading, hauling wood, tending ovens. Nothing about peasant food comes easily. By midday, you walk farther through the village lanes where muddy water trickles between cottages. Laundry hangs stiff in the cold breeze. A pig roots enthusiastically beside a ditch while geese patrol nearby with the suspicious temperament of armed guards. At one cottage, you glimpse dinner preparations already beginning despite the early hour. More pottage, naturally. The pot never truly rests. Into it goes whatever can be spared: cabbage leaves, onions, beans, perhaps a scrap of smoked bacon if fortune has recently smiled. Meat remains rare here. Most peasants cannot afford to slaughter animals casually. Chickens provide eggs. Cows provide milk. Pigs become precious winter stores only after careful planning. Fresh meat appears mainly during festivals, weddings, or accidents involving particularly unlucky livestock. Some swear poor villagers could identify noble feasts from miles away simply by following the smell of roasting meat drifting across fields. You suspect they probably could. As afternoon fades toward evening, you return to the same cottage where the morning began. The fire burns lower now, wet boots dry beside the hearth. The family gathers close while wind rattles softly against the walls. Supper looks remarkably similar to breakfast, and tomorrow's meal likely will too. Yet there is a strange steadiness in this rhythm, the endless simmering pot, the dark bread, the shared bowls, survival repeated day after day beneath smoke-dark beams while winter presses against the door. You sit quietly with warm pottage in your hands while outside the countryside grows dim beneath gathering dusk. The dog curls beside the fire at last, finally satisfied with his management of your journey. And somewhere beyond the dark fields, inside candle-lit halls glowing with beeswax and spice, the nobles prepare very different meals indeed. The following morning arrives wrapped in pale frost instead of rain. Thin ice clings to puddles along the village path, and every breath rises white into the still air. You leave the peasant cottages behind while smoke from their hearths drifts upward in long grey ribbons across the waking fields. The dog follows for a while, then stops beside a ditch to investigate something deeply important and probably unpleasant. Ahead, the manor stands above the countryside once more, its stone walls glowing faintly gold beneath the weak winter sun. Servants are already awake inside. You can tell by the smoke pouring from kitchen chimneys and by the constant movement of figures crossing the courtyard carrying buckets, baskets, and armfuls of wood. Breakfast for nobles begins quietly compared to the noisy chaos of evening feasts. The great hall remains mostly empty this early, its rush-covered floors still carrying yesterday's faint smells of smoke, spilled ale, and roasted meat. Beeswax candles flicker softly beside narrow windows where pale morning light slips through leaded glass. Somewhere overhead, footsteps cross wooden galleries while servants prepare private chambers upstairs. You're guided instead toward a smaller solar room reserved for members of the Lord's household and favoured guests. The difference strikes you immediately. Warmth gathers here more generously. Thick tapestries cover the walls to keep out draughts. Cushioned benches sit beside the hearth. The wooden table is polished smooth by years of careful use, rather than scarred by knives and elbows. Even the air smells different, less smoke, more herbs and warmed wine. A sleepy nobleman wrapped in a fur-lined robe sits near the fire while a servant trims candle wicks nearby. His breakfast rests before him, already arranged with quiet precision. White bread again, of course. Soft Manchee loaves still warm from the bakehouse, small dishes of butter, honey thick as amber, preserved cherries floating in syrup imported months ago from southern estates, a cup of warmed wine spiced lightly with cinnamon. You suddenly understand that noble breakfasts are not meant merely to satisfy hunger. They are meant to reassure wealth. Even in winter, even before sunrise, even while peasants beyond the walls eat cabbage broth from wooden bowls, a young nobleman tears delicately at a piece of bread while listening to a servant read aloud from a devotional text. She eats slowly, carefully. Medieval table manners among the wealthy place surprising emphasis on restraint. No grabbing, no loud chewing. No reaching across dishes. One handbook apparently warns gentlemen against scratching themselves at table like restless monkeys. Solid advice across most centuries, honestly. You accept a slice of fine bread yourself. The texture feels astonishing after days of coarse rye and barley. Light, soft, almost sweet compared to peasant loaves. Butter melts immediately across the warm surface. Nearby, Another servant pours almond milk into a silver cup. Real dairy milk appears less often among the wealthy during fasting periods ordered by the church. Almond milk becomes a fashionable substitute despite requiring expensive imported almonds. Medieval nobles possess a remarkable ability to transform religious sacrifice into culinary luxury. Some swear wealthy kitchens even shaped almond paste into imitation eggs and meats during fasting seasons, simply to avoid feeling deprived. No one seems entirely certain whether God found this creative or irritating. The room slowly fills with low conversation. Estate matters, grain storage, hunting plans, rumours from nearby towns. One knight complains bitterly about river tolls while spooning honey onto bread worth more than a peasant family might spend on food in several days. Outside the narrow windows, frost still covers the fields. Inside, servants refill cups before they're half empty. The contrast follows you everywhere now. You notice it in the fabrics drying beside the hearth. Noble cloaks lined with squirrel fur, peasant wool rough as old rope. You notice it in hands too. Soft fingers carrying silver cups upstairs. Cracked red hands hauling water below stairs before dawn. And most clearly of all, you notice it in food. Breakfast continues with small dishes arriving one after another. Soft-boiled eggs sprinkled with herbs, pears preserved in honey, fresh cheese flavoured with caraway seeds, thin slices of smoked eel beside mustard sauce. The nobleman near the hearth barely glances at half of it. Abundance changes appetite strangely. In the village cottages, every crumb disappeared immediately. Here, servants quietly remove untouched crusts and half-finished fruit. Nothing is entirely wasted, though. Leftovers descend through the household ranks carefully. Upper servants eat what nobles leave behind. Lower servants eat after them. Scraps finally reach labourers, beggars, or dogs waiting near the kitchens. The entire manor feeds itself like a slow-moving river flowing downward from the high table. A bell rings somewhere deeper inside the manor, followed by faint chanting drifting from the private chapel. Several nobles cross themselves automatically before returning to breakfast. Religion wraps itself around meals constantly in this world. Prayers before eating. Saints invoked for healthy harvests. Fasting days controlling what may or may not touch the table. One elderly woman nearby refuses pears during cold weather because she believes they invite dampness into the lungs. Another insists cinnamon strengthens the heart against winter sadness. Even now, it is hard to tell where medicine ends and superstition begins. You wander briefly toward the kitchens again, where noble breakfasts emerge through organized chaos. Cooks move rapidly between hearths, while spits turn slowly over glowing coals. A boy grinds spices using a stone mortar under the stern eye of the head cook. The scent is extraordinary. Pepper, cloves, warm bread, honey, smoke. Spices remain among the clearest signs of wealth in medieval Europe. Tiny amounts travel enormous distances through dangerous trade routes. A pouch of pepper may pass through dozens of hands before reaching this cold northern manor. And yet nobles scatter it over breakfast eggs without much thought. One kitchen servant notices your amazement. "The Lord likes pepper," she shrugs, as though that explains international commerce entirely. Near the ovens, you overhear two cooks arguing whether rich food weakens the stomach. One claims peasants stay healthier because coarse bread and onions keep the body strong. The other replies that peasants die younger precisely because their food resembles livestock feed. Neither appears fully convinced by the other. Outside the kitchens, you climb a narrow stair leading briefly to an upper gallery overlooking the great hall below. Morning light spills across empty benches where last night's feast took place. Servants sweep rushes into piles while dogs patrol hopefully for forgotten scraps. The hall feels peaceful now, sleepy, the fire reduced to low glowing embers. You lean against the cold stone wall and realize something quietly unsettling. The nobles and peasants living on the same estate inhabit almost different worlds entirely, despite standing only a few hundred steps apart. Different bread, different smells, different expectations of hunger itself. For peasants, food means endurance. For nobles, food means display. And somewhere between these worlds stand the servants carrying trays endlessly up and down narrow corridors, while monastery bells drift softly over the frost-covered fields beyond the walls. By the time you descend again, the breakfast table upstairs is already being cleared. Beeswax candles gutter softly in the warming room. A servant gathers untouched crusts carefully into a basket. The smell of cinnamon still lingers faintly in the air. Outside, the village smoke rises thin and grey against the winter sky. And beneath it all, from cottage hearths and noble kitchens alike, the same ancient human hunger continues quietly shaping the rhythm of medieval life. By midday, the frost has melted into long ribbons of mud again, and the road leading away from the manor churns beneath cartwheels and boots alike. You travel with the small stream of villagers heading toward the market town several miles beyond the river crossing. The dog has returned, naturally, appearing beside you without explanation like a particularly muddy spirit assigned to supervise your poor decisions. The countryside unfolds slowly beneath a pale grey sky. Bare trees creak softly in the wind. Ravens hop across harvested fields searching for forgotten grain. Somewhere distant, an axe strikes wood in steady rhythm. Medieval life is full of sounds that repeat endlessly: bells, hammers, grinding stones, footsteps, coughing, prayer. And always, somewhere, cooking. The market town reveals itself first through smell before sight. Smoke, fish, wet wool, horses, baking bread, human crowds packed too closely beside open drains. The scent rolls outward across the road long before you pass through the timber gate, where tired guards collect tolls from merchants entering with loaded carts. Nobody enjoys paying market tolls. One farmer mutters darkly that by the time lords, bridge keepers, and tax collectors finish taking their share, his cabbages technically belong to 14 different people. Inside the town walls, movement surrounds you immediately. Traders shout prices beneath striped awnings while carts grind through muddy streets deep enough to swallow careless shoes. Geese wander everywhere with criminal confidence. Apprentices hurry carrying baskets of onions, smoked fish, and apples bruised by winter storage. The market square itself feels like the stomach of the entire region. Everything flows here eventually. You pass tables stacked with dark rye loaves still steaming from ovens nearby. Beside them sit smaller piles of pale wheat bread carefully protected beneath cloth covers. Noticeably more expensive, even among townsfolk, bread announces social rank instantly. A baker proudly displays white manchis reserved for wealthy customers. Soft enough for old teeth, he boasts. A peasant woman nearby replies that strong teeth are cheaper. Several people laugh while the baker pretends deep offence. You wander farther through the crowded square where food changes constantly from stall to stall. Wheels of cheese, bundles of leeks tied with string, dried peas, garlic hanging in thick ropes, salted herring laid across wooden boards like silver scales, buckets of oysters packed in damp seaweed from coastal traders far away. The wealthy buy choice. The poor buy endurance. That difference sits visible on every table around you. At one stall, a merchant carefully measures imported spices onto tiny scales: pepper, cloves, nutmeg, saffron glowing red gold against dark cloth. The prices are astonishing enough that you briefly wonder whether the saffron strands are secretly spun from dragon hair. The merchant notices your expression and grins. "Worth more than pigs some seasons," he says proudly. Nearby, meanwhile, villagers bargain fiercely over onions and barley. No one can quite agree whether medieval markets are places of opportunity or carefully organised arguments that happen to involve vegetables. You stop beside a fishmonger gutting river trout with terrifying speed. Fish matters enormously in medieval diets because the church declares so many fasting days throughout the year. Meat becomes forbidden regularly, especially during Lent and other holy periods. Naturally, people respond by becoming extremely creative about fish. One monk passing through the market insists puffins count as fish because they spend so much time near water. Another claims barnacle geese grow from driftwood and therefore qualify for fasting meals too. Medieval religion occasionally resembles a very determined legal debate conducted by hungry people. The trout seller shrugs when asked about such matters. If it swims, flies, or falls from heaven, somebody'll eat it on a fasting day. Fair enough. Near the centre of the market square, wealth announces itself more boldly. Wealthy merchants and lesser nobles arrive on horseback with fur-lined cloaks, and servants following behind carrying baskets. They purchase finer goods, almost casually imported wine, white bread, preserved fruits, honey cakes dusted lightly with costly spices. One nobleman complains that last week's figs arrived slightly dry. A nearby turnip seller hears this and looks moments away from challenging him to combat. You drift toward a tavern wall where travelling merchants warm themselves beside braziers filled with charcoal. One man from the south describes noble banquets where entire roasted swans appear covered again in feathers before serving. Some swear cooks occasionally stitch skins back onto roasted animals purely for spectacle. Even now, it is hard to tell whether these stories are truth or simply medieval versions of fishermen exaggerating the size of their catch. Still, after seeing noble kitchens yourself, you suspect at least some of it might be real. A bell rings from the church tower overhead, scattering pigeons across the rooftops. Market crowds shift and tighten again as afternoon trade grows busier. Monks move quietly between stalls purchasing supplies for nearby abbeys. One carries barrels of ale while another carefully inspects onions with the seriousness of a military commander reviewing troops. You follow the smell of roasting chestnuts toward a small fire near the square's edge. A woman sells hot chestnuts wrapped in scraps of parchment. Nearby, labourers eat thick slices of coarse bread dipped into onion broth carried from home in clay jars. Simple meals. Portable meals. Meals built around surviving long workdays rather than impressing guests. And yet only a few steps away, inside an upper-story merchant house overlooking the market, you glimpse servants laying linen cloths across a table already crowded with white bread, sweet pastries, wine cups, and glazed fruits. Two worlds again. Always two worlds. The market reveals them side by side more clearly than anywhere else. Poor villagers calculate whether they can afford enough grain until spring. Wealthy households debate spice quality while purchasing imported almonds by the sack. One child begs for crusts near the church steps, while another noble boy complains because his honey cake contains fewer raisins than yesterday's. The dog watches both situations with equal interest provided food remains involved. By late afternoon, the market slowly begins settling into weary order. Unsold vegetables disappear back into carts. Fishmongers throw scraps toward waiting dogs and gulls. Bakers wrap remaining loaves carefully against evening damp. You buy a simple meal from a widow selling hot pottage beside the gate. Barley, onion, leek, thickened with stale bread. As you eat standing beside the smoky fire, you watch wealthy customers climb toward the inns where candles already glow warmly behind shuttered windows. Somewhere upstairs, servants prepare richer suppers with wine and spices and fresh white bread. Meanwhile, labourers tighten worn cloaks against the cold and carry dark loaves home through gathering dusk. The church bells ring again overhead. Their sound drifts slowly across the muddy square where rich and poor alike move beneath the same fading sky, all searching for warmth, supper, and perhaps one more decent loaf before winter deepens further. Night settles over the manor with a heavy winter stillness that muffles even the barking dogs beyond the walls. Frost gathers pale along the courtyard stones while servants hurry between buildings carrying lanterns protected carefully against the wind. Above, narrow windows glow amber through the darkness, and from somewhere deep inside the kitchens comes the rich drifting scent of roasting meat. After days among peasant cottages and crowded markets, the smell nearly stops you in your tracks. Not because you are hungry anymore, because the difference feels almost unreal. You step once more through the great hall doors where warmth rushes over you in thick, smoky waves. Tonight the chamber blazes with torchlight. Beeswax candles burn along the high table in polished holders. Fresh rushes cover the stone floor, mixed with lavender and sweet herbs meant to soften the odour of wet boots, old ale, and several dozen people gathered close together. The hall feels alive now. Servants cross constantly through the firelit haze carrying platters above their shoulders. Hounds weave beneath benches searching for opportunity. Musicians near the hearth tune stringed instruments while a tired-looking boy taps quietly on a drum that appears older than most kingdoms. At the raised table, nobles settle heavily into carved chairs lined with cushions and fur. Velvet sleeves brush polished wood. Silver cups gleam in candlelight. Rings flash against goblets filled with dark imported wine. And then the meat arrives. A whole roasted boar carried between 4 servants, its skin lacquered brown with honey and herbs. Steam curls upward beneath the hall rafters, while conversations briefly pause in collective admiration. Apples fill the animal's mouth for decoration, though one old knight whispers loudly that he would rather they filled it with more meat. Reasonable priorities. Behind the boar come platters of venison, roasted capons, swan, rabbit pies sealed beneath golden pastry crusts, and sausages fragrant with garlic and pepper. Sauces accompany everything, thick green herb sauces, mustard sharpened enough to wake the dead, wine reductions dark as polished oak. The smells alone seem almost luxurious after weeks of onion broth and cabbage steam. You notice immediately that noble meals are performances as much as nourishment. Servants carve meat publicly before guests. Salt cellars shaped from silver sit prominently near the Lord's place. The finest cuts move carefully toward important diners first, while lesser retainers watch politely from below. Even the seating arrangements matter. The steward quietly explains that honoured guests sit closest to the Lord, while lesser knights and household officers stretch farther down the board. Rank flows through the room as visibly as candlelight. Above the salt, below the salt. Entire lives summarized by table geography. You take a place among lesser guests midway down the hall where food remains plentiful by ordinary standards, though noticeably simpler than the dishes nearest the Lord. Even here, however, the richness overwhelms compared to peasant fare. A servant lays down trenchers before you, thick stale bread slices serving as plates. Soon gravy and meat juices soak deeply into them. Later, these soaked trenchers may go to servants, beggars, or monastery almshouses if not entirely devoured first. Nothing wastes easily, even in wealth. A platter of roasted goose passes near enough for you to smell the crisp skin seasoned with cloves and sage. Beside it comes soft white bread still warm from the ovens. You tear off a piece almost absent-mindedly and realize again how soft noble bread truly is. No grit, no husks, No desperate substitutions hidden in the flour, just wheat carefully milled for people wealthy enough to demand refinement from grain itself. Across the hall, labourers and lower servants eat different food entirely. Bowls of pottage, dark bread, perhaps scraps of meat if the kitchens remain generous tonight. Better than village fare, certainly, but still far removed from the abundance above. The contrast hums quietly beneath every conversation. A musician begins playing near the hearth while servants refill cups with wine and strong ale. The nobleman beside you explains proudly that his household imports pepper from lands so distant most villagers cannot imagine them properly. Costs more than armour, he says while seasoning roasted venison. Meanwhile, somewhere outside these walls, peasants probably eat turnips beside smoky fires. No one mentions this directly. They do not need to. A young page nearly drops a platter while navigating between benches, and receives such a fierce glare from the steward that he visibly shrinks 2 inches smaller. Medieval feasts depend entirely upon servants moving with impossible precision through crowded halls carrying dangerous amounts of hot gravy. Honestly, one spilled sauce probably caused at least 3 political crises somewhere in Europe. You sample a spoonful of thick almond sauce served over capon. Sweet, creamy. Strange at first, medieval nobles adore combining flavours. Modern people rarely mix meat with fruit, sugar with fish, cinnamon with wine. Some swear wealthy cooks layered spices heavily not only for taste but to demonstrate expense openly. A dish fragrant with saffron and cloves announces power before anyone takes the first bite. Near the high table, a physician attached to the household discusses food with scholarly seriousness. Medieval medicine teaches that health depends upon balancing bodily humours hot, cold, wet, dry. Certain foods supposedly warm the blood. Others cool dangerous passions. One doctor insists pears should never follow fish. Another claims beef encourages melancholy. Even now, it is hard to tell whether these theories comfort people or simply give scholars excuses to argue during dinner. The feast stretches slowly across hours. Candles burn lower. Wine deepens conversation. Bones accumulate beside plates for waiting dogs below the benches. You watch servants carrying endless trays from kitchens glowing red with heat. Roasting spits turn steadily over massive hearths, while cooks shout through smoke thick enough to sting your eyes. Sweat runs down their faces despite the winter cold outside. The labour behind noble dining never truly disappears. It merely hides below stairs. One kitchen boy pauses briefly near the doorway clutching a basket of white loaves. Flour dust clings to his sleeves. He cannot be older than 12. Before he can rest properly, another servant snaps for him to move faster. The feast above depends entirely on invisible exhaustion below. Late in the evening comes the ceremonial presentation. Everyone waits for a towering pie carried into the hall, while musicians strike louder notes. Steam escapes dramatically as the crust splits open. Inside are pigeons. Actual pigeons. Cooked, thankfully, though one drunk knight appears mildly disappointed by this fact. Those who tell the tale never fully agree whether medieval nobles genuinely enjoyed such spectacles, or simply feared appearing unimpressed beside rivals. Perhaps both. You lean back at last while the hall glows warm around you. Grease crackles softly in the hearth. Wine cups reflect candlelight. Rich smells of meat and spice cling to wool cloaks and hanging tapestries alike. And somewhere beyond these thick stone walls, in dark cottages beneath leaking roofs, peasant families stir cabbage into simmering pots, while winter winds creep through the cracks. The same night covers both worlds, but not the same supper. Long after the manor feast ends, you leave the warmth of the great hall and step once more into the winter dark. Cold air rushes against your face so sharply that the rich smells of roasted meat and wine seem to vanish instantly from your clothes. Frost glitters pale beneath the moonlight across the courtyard stones. Somewhere beyond the stables, a horse snorts softly in its sleep. The dog reappears beside you again, apparently convinced you remain incapable of surviving without supervision. Together you follow the muddy road back toward the peasant cottages scattered beyond the manor fields. The sky above hangs low and clear now, crowded with cold stars. Your boots crunch lightly over frozen ruts, while distant monastery bells drift across the countryside like sounds carried through water. Behind you, the manor still glows with candlelight. Ahead, only scattered cottage fires flicker through the dark. You begin noticing how differently night feels depending on wealth. In noble halls, darkness retreats before beeswax candles, hearth fires, polished lanterns. In poorer homes, night presses close against the walls almost immediately after sunset because candles cost dearly and firewood must last the winter. By the time you reach the village, most windows are already dark. Only thin strips of orange light escape beneath shutters and through gaps in the thatch. Smoke drifts low between cottages carrying the scent of damp wood and boiled cabbage. Somewhere nearby, someone coughs steadily through the cold. Inside the first cottage, supper still simmers over the hearth. Not a feast, not spectacle, just endurance again. The same blackened pottage pot hangs above glowing embers, though tonight the broth appears slightly richer. A small piece of salted pork has been added, filling the room with a savoury smell powerful enough to make every child glance hopefully toward the fire. Meat remains precious here. Even a few scraps transform the mood of a meal entirely. You duck beneath the low doorway while the family shifts closer together to make space near the hearth. The room feels crowded but warm. Wet cloaks steam gently beside the fire. Straw crackles beneath boots. A baby sleeps wrapped tightly in wool while an old grandmother spins thread near the wall with slow, patient movements. Supper begins quietly. Bowls pass hand to hand. Wooden spoons scrape against clay. Bread tears apart in rough, uneven chunks. The salted pork disappears quickly into the stew, less a meal itself than a flavour shared among many people. You taste the broth carefully. Thicker than before, smokier, the pork salt spreading through beans and barley until even cabbage tastes almost luxurious. Hunger sharpens appreciation in ways noble tables rarely understand. A labourer beside you sighs happily after the first mouthful. Tastes nearly like festival food, he says. The room laughs softly. Nearly. That word carries enormous weight here. Near the fire, the grandmother drops herbs into the pot while muttering that time keeps winter sickness from entering the chest. No one questions her. Medieval households rely heavily on herbs, charms, and inherited remedies passed between generations like secret maps against suffering. Some swear parsley wards off evil spirits if planted near the doorway. Others insist garlic keeps nightmares away when hung above sleeping children. Even now, it's hard to tell whether people truly believe these things or simply feel safer pretending they might work. Outside, wind brushes softly against the cottage walls. Inside, the fire settles lower. You watch supper unfold slowly and realize how communal peasant meals must become by necessity. One pot feeds everyone. One hearth warms everyone. One loaf breaks into many hands. Wealth encourages separation private chambers, separate dishes, servants carrying food individually upstairs. Poverty pulls people together beside the same fire whether they wish it or not. The children finish eating first and immediately begin scraping bowls clean with crusts of dark rye bread. Nothing wastes, not broth, not grease, not crumbs. One little girl carefully gathers fallen pieces from the table into her apron pocket for tomorrow morning. At the manor feast earlier, untouched white bread disappeared casually into servant baskets. Two worlds again. Always. A young man enters carrying firewood tied with rope and reports hearing wolves somewhere near the forest road. The room grows briefly quiet. Winter sharpens every danger. Hunger belongs not only to people out here. The grandmother spits lightly toward the hearth for luck. No one can quite agree whether this custom protects the house from wolves or merely annoys the fire spirits supposedly living beneath the chimney stones. Honestly, medieval superstition often sounds like people trying to negotiate politely with the universe just in case it is listening. As the evening deepens, conversation drifts toward harvest memories, weather signs, and food stores remaining for winter. One woman worries aloud about dwindling grain barrels. Another says the monastery sometimes distributes extra bread during harsh seasons if the abbey ovens remain productive. A man near the doorway replies dryly that monks grow generous mainly when they fear hungry peasants may begin looking at monastery pigs too lovingly. Fair observation. You notice how carefully everyone measures food mentally even while eating, how many onions remain hanging from the rafters, how much salted fish survives in storage, whether the cabbages will last until spring thaw. For nobles, meals display status. For peasants, meals measure time. The fire crackles lower again. Someone adds more wood reluctantly. Fuel matters almost as much as food during winter. Smoke-black beams overhead hold years of soot from fires kept alive through endless cold seasons. The cottage smells of ash, wool, damp earth, and simmering broth soaked permanently into the walls themselves. You lean closer toward the warmth, while outside frost thickens silently across the village lanes. The dog sleeps heavily now beside the hearth, paws twitching occasionally in dreams probably involving stolen sausages. An old man begins telling stories softly while mending a broken harness strap. He claims that during the great famine years long ago, some villagers survived almost entirely on nettle soup and oatcakes hard enough to roof houses. Those who tell the tale never fully agree whether conditions were truly that terrible, or whether old men simply enjoy terrifying younger generations before bed. Still, looking around this cottage, you suspect hunger never lies very far beneath the surface of medieval life. And yet neither does resilience. The family shares what little they have without ceremony. Bowls refill when possible. Bread passes automatically towards smaller hands first. The grandmother quietly tucks an extra crust beside the sleeping child. No silver goblets. No saffron sauces. No towers of roasted meat beneath candlelight. Just warm broth beside the fire while winter presses gently against the walls. By the time the embers fade toward red and conversation slows into tired silence, you realize something the manor feast never quite revealed. The noble table offers abundance, but this smoky little cottage offers something else entirely. A kind of stubborn closeness built from shared hunger, shared labour, and shared warmth beneath the same leaking roof while the cold medieval night stretches endlessly outside. Several days later, the bells of the nearby abbey begin ringing before dawn, their slow, heavy tones rolling across frozen fields beneath a sky still dark with stars. You wake in the peasant cottage to the sound drifting faintly through the smoke-black rafters overhead. The grandmother beside the hearth crosses herself automatically before adding more wood to the embers. Today is a fasting day, which in medieval Europe happens often enough that people spend an astonishing amount of energy thinking about food they technically are not supposed to enjoy. You follow the muddy road toward the abbey as pale morning light slowly spills across the countryside. Frost clings silver to hedgerows, crows gather atop bare trees. The dog trots beside you faithfully until spotting a suspicious chicken near the monastery gate, at which point his spiritual journey takes a different direction entirely. The abbey rises from the mist ahead, all cold stone walls and narrow windows glowing softly with candlelight. Monastery bells continue tolling overhead, while monks in dark wool robes move silently through the courtyard carrying baskets, barrels, and bundles of firewood. The smell surprises you first. Fish. Salted fish, smoked fish, stewed fish, drying fish. Apparently medieval Christianity has many opinions about fish. Inside the monastery kitchens, the atmosphere differs greatly from noble halls or peasant cottages. Less noisy perhaps, though no less busy. Steam curls upward from enormous cauldrons while cooks move carefully between hearths blackened by decades of smoke. Herbs hang drying from ceiling beams beside strings of onions and garlic. One monk stirring a pot of eel stew nods politely toward you without pausing his work. Abbey kitchens feed large communities, daily monks, travellers, pilgrims, servants, poor villagers seeking charity, sometimes even wandering knights. Efficiency matters here more than spectacle. Still, the food is far from miserable. A brother carrying trays explains the church's fasting rules while leading you through the warm kitchen haze. Meat from warm-blooded animals becomes forbidden on many holy days. Fish, however, remains acceptable. Naturally, medieval people interpret this creatively. Some swear beavers count as fish because their tails spend time in water. Others argue barnacle geese grow from driftwood and therefore qualify during fasts. Even now, it is hard to tell whether these beliefs come from sincere theology or desperate culinary optimism. The monk shrugs when asked. God knows the heart, he says calmly, but kitchens know loopholes. Fair enough. Breakfast in the abbey guest house arrives quietly after morning prayers. Thick oat porridge sweetened lightly with honey. Brown bread still warm from monastery ovens. Smoked herring beside mustard. Weak ale served in wooden cups. Simple. Orderly. Surprisingly comforting. You notice immediately that monastery bread sits somewhere between noble and peasant loaves. Better flour than most villagers can afford, but less refined than aristocratic manchets. Monasteries often own mills and fields themselves, giving abbeys more stable food supplies than surrounding villages. Knowledge helps too. Monks preserve recipes, farming methods, brewing techniques, herb gardens. Medieval monasteries function partly as spiritual centres and partly as extremely organised survival institutions powered by bells and cabbage. A tired-looking novice accidentally spills ale while serving guests and receives only a weary sigh from the older monk nearby. Apparently even holy men understand mornings. After breakfast, you wander through the abbey grounds where winter gardens sit bare beneath frost. Herb plots remain carefully marked despite the cold. Sage, fennel, rue, mint. Plants used for medicine as much as cooking. One elderly monk explains solemnly that fennel sharpens eyesight and keeps evil spirits away from doorways. Another claims onions prevent plague. No one can quite agree whether medieval medicine heals people or simply gives them extremely flavourful breath. Near the fish sheds beside the stream, workers clean barrels of salted cod imported from distant coasts. The smell alone nearly defeats you. Salt preserves life through winter, but it also transforms entire buildings into permanent monuments to fish. Pilgrims arriving at the abbey seem entirely unbothered, though most carry travel bread, dried apples, onions, and whatever smoked meat remains from easier days before the fasting calendar interrupted their happiness. At midday, the monastery refectory fills slowly beneath long vaulted ceilings. Sunlight filters dimly through narrow windows while monks take their places silently at wooden tables. Meals here unfold with ritual precision. Prayers first, then eating. Conversation remains minimal while one monk reads scripture aloud from a raised pulpit. Honestly, trying to enjoy cabbage stew while listening to stern Latin readings about sin feels like an advanced medieval skill. Bowls of fish pottage arrive steaming beside loaves of coarse bread. Today's meal includes eel cooked with leeks and herbs, thickened slightly with oats, not luxurious perhaps, but nourishing enough against the winter cold. You notice the monks eat steadily without much waste or complaint. Monastic life values moderation heavily. Too much indulgence risks spiritual weakness. Too much starvation weakens prayer and labour alike. Balance matters, at least in theory. One particularly round monk reaching for extra bread suggests theory occasionally loses arguments against butter. After the meal, leftover scraps gather carefully into baskets for the poor waiting near the abbey gate. Beggars already cluster there wrapped in ragged cloaks against the cold wind. One woman holds a child beneath patched blankets while watching the kitchens hopefully. Food charity forms a major part of monastic life. Not purely from kindness, perhaps. Feeding the poor helps save souls too. Medieval religion often combines compassion with practical spiritual accounting in fascinating ways. As evening approaches, snow finally begins drifting down across the abbey roofs in soft, slow flakes. Bells ring again through the dimming light while smoke rises from kitchen chimneys into the grey sky. Supper tonight remains humble. Brown bread, fish broth, cheese, warm ale, and yet after days of crossing muddy roads and freezing cottages, the steady rhythm of monastery life feels strangely calming. Bells mark time predictably, meals arrive reliably, fires remain tended. Even hunger itself seems more organised here. You sit near the guest house hearth while outside snow gathers quietly against the stone walls. Pilgrims dry wet boots nearby. A monk copies manuscripts beneath candlelight with ink-stained fingers, while another repairs fishing nets patiently beside the fire. The smell of salted fish lingers everywhere. The dog eventually curls near your feet again, smelling faintly of wet feathers and poor decisions. And as the bells toll one final time across the snowy abbey grounds, you begin understanding that in medieval life even fasting reveals social rank clearly. Nobles avoid meat with expensive fish and almond dishes. Peasants avoid meat because they rarely possess much anyway. But monks somewhere between both worlds transform restraint itself into ritual beneath cold stone arches and candlelit prayer. Snow remains on the ground the next morning, though already the monastery paths have turned grey and slushy beneath boots and cart wheels. The abbey bells ring through a sky the colour of old pewter, while smoke drifts low from kitchen chimneys into the frozen air. You leave the guest house wrapped tightly in a borrowed wool cloak that smells faintly of incense, damp hay, and someone else's difficult winter. The dog emerges from beneath a cart carrying half a fish skeleton like a sacred trophy. Clearly monastery life suits him. Inside the abbey kitchens, preparations for a noble visitor are already underway. The local lord plans to stop briefly on his return from inspecting distant lands, which means the monks now move with a controlled panic of men trying to appear spiritually detached while also desperately searching for enough clean table linens. You quickly discover that fasting may shape medieval eating, but status still shapes it more. The head cook stands beside a long wooden table where tiny piles of spices rest upon folded cloth. Pepper dark as soot, saffron threads glowing gold red, cinnamon bark imported from impossibly distant places, cloves with their sharp, almost medicinal scent. The room smells extraordinary. Warm wine, honey, smoke. Foreign lands compressed into tiny expensive powders. A young novice carefully measures peppercorns while the cook watches with the expression of a man supervising gold dust during a hurricane. Too much ruins the dish, the cook mutters. Then, after a pause, too little ruins the reputation. That seems to summarize noble cooking remarkably well. You wander closer while cooks begin preparing sauces thickened with almond milk and breadcrumbs. A pot of wine simmers gently beside the hearth, flavoured with cloves and cinnamon. Nearby, fish cooks slowly beneath herbs and saffron despite technically being a fasting meal. Because wealthy medieval people possess an incredible talent for making religious restraint smell delicious. One monk explains that spices do more than improve taste. According to medieval medicine, certain spices warm the body against cold humours, strengthen digestion, and protect noble stomachs from illness. Some swear pepper chases away bad air. Others insist saffron lifts melancholy. Even now, it is hard to tell whether spices functioned mainly as medicine, luxury, or polite excuses for showing off international trade routes during dinner. Probably all three. You remember the peasant cottage where onions transformed ordinary broth into a good supper. Here, entire conversations revolve around whether cinnamon pairs properly with fish. Two worlds again. Always. By midday, the abbey receives its visitors. Horses clatter through the gatehouse while servants unload baggage wrapped carefully against snow. The noble household enters trailing fur-lined cloaks and expensive perfume that briefly overpowers the usual monastery scents of candle wax and boiled cabbage. A lady removes her gloves near the hearth and immediately requests warmed wine with nutmeg. Nutmeg! In a snow-covered abbey surrounded by muddy turnip fields. The scale of medieval trade suddenly feels astonishing. At table, the visiting nobles receive dishes entirely different from the ordinary monastic fare. Delicate white bread appears beside trenchers dusted lightly with spices. Almond pastries arrive glazed with honey. Fish is served beneath golden saffron sauce bright enough to resemble treasure. Meanwhile, labourers outside the kitchens eat oat porridge beside the woodpile. The contrast no longer surprises you, but it continues fascinating you. A physician travelling with the noble household begins discussing food theory while warming his hands beside the fire. Medieval medicine treats the body almost like a kitchen itself. Ingredients must balance properly. Cold foods require warming spices. Moist humours require drying foods. Rich meats supposedly need sharp sauces to aid digestion. He explains solemnly that pepper helps older men maintain vitality during winter. One monk quietly replies that younger men seem equally enthusiastic about pepper regardless. The physician pretends not to hear him. You notice how spices become symbols as much as ingredients. Wealthy households display them openly in ornate containers. Guests comment upon them admiringly. Servants handle them carefully. A noblewoman at the high table sprinkles cinnamon over pears with the same graceful pride another person might display jewels. Because in some ways, spices are jewels. Tiny edible proof that a household commands wealth reaching far beyond local fields and muddy villages. Outside, snow begins falling again across the abbey courtyard. Inside, kitchen heat fogs the windows while saffron stains wooden spoons gold. One servant tells you quietly that some nobles carry small spice boxes while travelling, locking them personally to prevent theft. Pepper can cost enough to tempt even trusted servants. No one can quite agree whether medieval nobles loved spices for flavour or simply because ordinary people could not afford them. Perhaps luxury itself becomes the seasoning. Near the pantry, you watch cooks preparing hippocras, a spiced wine sweetened with honey and strained carefully through cloth. The smell drifts warmly through the corridor's cloves, cinnamon, ginger. The dog sneezes violently near the spice table and is immediately banished outdoors. Probably wise. As evening settles, the abbey dining chamber glows softly beneath rows of candles. Snow presses thick against the narrow windows now, muting the outside world almost completely. The noble visitors dine separately from the monks, though prayers begin both meals alike. Even in wealth, ritual remains unavoidable here. You sit among lesser guests watching platters pass slowly down the table. White bread, herb sauces, stewed fish rich with almonds and wine, small cakes flavoured with anise. Delicious, certainly, but also strangely fragile somehow. Because every luxury here depends upon endless uncertain chains, merchants crossing dangerous roads, ships surviving storms, harvests succeeding, taxes collected properly, servants labouring invisibly below stairs. Peasant food feels sturdy. Noble food feels vulnerable to interruption. One bad winter, one failed caravan, one war along a trade route. Suddenly pepper disappears from northern tables entirely. The monks seem aware of this in ways nobles perhaps are not. Their kitchens remain practical beneath the luxury layered temporarily upon them. Grain stores matter more than cinnamon. Salt matters more than sugar. Survival first. Elegance second. Late into the evening, the noble visitors retire beside blazing fires carrying cups of spiced wine upstairs. Servants clear tables while monks return quietly to prayers and chores. Snow continues falling softly beyond the walls. You linger near the kitchen hearth where cooks finally rest aching feet beside empty spice bowls and half-burned candles. The head cook rubs saffron stains from his fingers and sighs heavily. All this, he says, gesturing toward the feast remains, and tomorrow somebody still complains the fish was dry. Medieval luxury, you realize, does not reduce human dissatisfaction nearly as much as people hope. The fire settles lower. Outside, bells ring faintly through the snow-covered darkness. And somewhere far beyond the abbey walls, peasants stir onions into simple broth, while nobles upstairs sip cinnamon wine beside fur blankets. Each world separated not merely by walls or wealth, but by entirely different expectations of what food itself should mean. A thaw arrives 2 days later, turning the snowy roads beyond the abbey into long rivers of grey mud. Water drips steadily from rooftops and bare tree branches, while the countryside exhales that damp, earthy smell which always follows melting frost. You leave the monastery at dawn alongside a cluster of merchants and pilgrims heading toward the riverside town farther south. The dog accompanies you for nearly a mile before discovering a cart loaded with smoked sausages and immediately changing allegiances. Honestly, fair enough. The road winds slowly through fields soaked dark beneath low clouds. Travellers move carefully to avoid losing boots entirely in the ruts. A peddler beside you claims spring mud has swallowed better men than war ever did. Judging by the state of the road, you believe him completely. By midday, the travellers reach a roadside alehouse crouched beside a wooden bridge. Smoke rises from its chimney in thick, comforting curls. The sign above the door creaks in the wind, painted with a faded boar that now resembles a deeply unhappy potato. Inside, warmth and noise tumble together instantly. The common room smells of wet wool, spilled ale, smoke, onions, and humanity in its purest medieval form. Travellers crowd around rough wooden tables while servants weave between benches carrying steaming cups and bowls of stew. Near the hearth, boots dry beside crackling flames while a minstrel quietly tunes a lute no one requested but everyone tolerates. You settle onto a bench beneath soot-dark rafters and quickly notice the enormous variety of drinks passing through the room. Al dominates everything. Not rich noble wine. Not clear spring water. Ale, thick dark ale for labourers. lighter small ale for daily meals, stronger brews for merchants celebrating successful trade. Even children sip watered ale because safe drinking water remains unpredictable in many places. A serving woman drops a wooden cup before you with practiced efficiency. The ale tastes earthy and faintly sour, warm rather than cold, not especially strong, but comforting after hours on muddy roads. You realize medieval people probably spend half their lives mildly hydrated by grain. At the next table, several labourers share coarse bread with onions and hard cheese while washing it down with dark ale thick enough to nearly count as stew. One jokes that stronger ale makes bad roads shorter. Another replies that stronger ale mainly makes ditches deeper. Both arguments appear historically tested. Near the hearth, however, wealth drinks differently. A wealthy cloth merchant travelling with servants orders imported wine mulled with spices. Cinnamon floats atop the steaming surface alongside slices of preserved orange peel brought from southern ports. His silver drinking cup gleams in the firelight, while nearby peasants cradle simple wooden mugs between cracked hands. Two worlds again. Always. The alehouse keeper explains proudly that noble households often drink wine because vineyards farther south supply wealthy estates through trade routes. Common folk rely more heavily on ale, cider, and whatever local brewing allows. Monasteries brew extensively too. Some swear certain abbeys produce ale strong enough to restore health, courage, and poor judgment simultaneously. You suspect medieval brewing occasionally solved problems while creating several new ones immediately afterward. A travelling pilgrim nearby carries a leather flask filled with cider from western orchards. He offers a sip, tart, sharp, cleaner tasting than the heavy ale. He claims cider strengthens the stomach during long journeys. No one can quite agree whether medieval people drank alcohol mainly for safety, flavour, nutrition, or emotional endurance through winter. Probably all four. Bowls of stew begin appearing around the room as evening approaches. Thick pottage again for most travellers, barley, leeks, cabbage, perhaps a little bacon if fortune smiles. Alehouse food aims less for elegance and more for preventing people from collapsing halfway to the next village. Meanwhile, at the merchant's private table near the wall, servants lay out white bread, smoked eel, soft cheese, spiced wine, and honey cakes beside candles made from beeswax rather than tallow. Even here, on the same muddy roadside stop, wealth separates itself through food and drink instantly. You notice how noble wine changes the atmosphere around its drinkers. Cups refill slowly, conversation softens, drinking becomes part ceremony, part display. Ale among labourers feels entirely different, louder, faster, more practical, fuel for tired bodies. A tanner near the fire raises his mug and declares proudly that ale built England. A monk passing through replies dryly that ale also destroyed much of England every Saturday night. The room laughs hard enough that even the serving girl nearly drops a tray. Outside, rain begins tapping softly against the shutters while travellers settle deeper into the warm, smoky room. Wet cloaks steam near the hearth. Someone begins singing quietly near the back wall. The minstrel finally starts playing after realising escape is impossible. You watch drinks continue flowing through the alehouse like small liquid markers of status. Thin beer for stable boys, dark ale for labourers, cider for travellers, spiced wine for merchants, imported sweet wines for nobles. Every cup tells a story about wealth, trade, labour, and expectation. Near the kitchens, you overhear the alehouse keeper complaining about rising grain prices. Brewing depends upon harvest just as bread does. Poor harvest years mean weaker ale, smaller loaves, sharper tempers. Everything connects back to grain eventually in medieval life. The fire burns lower as night deepens. A physician travelling with the merchant explains solemnly that wine warms the blood while ale nourishes strength. Another man insists hot ale mixed with eggs cures chest illness. A woman nearby swears rosemary wine prevents nightmares. Even now, it is hard to tell whether medieval medicine treats beverages as remedies or simply refuses to waste opportunities for drinking. At supper, you receive thick stew with coarse bread and another mug of ale. Simple food, filling food, around you. Travellers settle into that sleepy warmth which comes after long roads, hot broth, and safe shelter from rain. The merchant nearby, meanwhile, finishes his spiced wine while servants arrange blankets upstairs in a private chamber. Two worlds sharing one roof tonight, but not the same table. By the time candles burn low and the room quiets into scattered murmurs, you lean back listening to rain against the shutters and cups clinking softly near the dying fire. The alehouse smells now of damp wool, yeast, smoke, and tired humanity. Outside stretches the endless muddy medieval road. Inside, rich and poor alike seek warmth through drink, though what fills their cups and why reveals far more about their lives than any conversation ever could. The rain finally stops sometime before dawn, leaving the countryside wrapped in cold silver mist. You leave the alehouse while the world still feels half asleep. Water drips steadily from bare branches overhead, and the muddy road gleams faintly beneath the weak morning light. Somewhere far behind you, a rooster attempts optimism. The dog returns again beside the bridge, smelling strongly of sausage theft and personal triumph. Together you continue southward through villages, preparing quietly for the long final stretch of winter. Smoke rises from cottages in thin, pale streams. Farmers inspect fields with worried expressions. Cartwheels creak beneath loads of firewood, and barrels sealed carefully against damp weather. Everywhere you travel now, people speak about stores. How much grain remains? How much salt? How many onions still hang from the rafters? Winter transforms food into arithmetic. By midday, you arrive at a manor grange where labourers and servants work among storage buildings clustered beside frozen fields. The steward allows travellers brief shelter from the wind, and soon you find yourself standing inside one of the great storehouses that keeps the estate alive through cold months. The smell hits immediately. Salt, smoke, dried grain, apples softening slowly in straw. The entire building smells like survival carefully stacked shelf upon shelf. Barrels line the walls from floor to ceiling. Salted fish packed tightly in brine. Smoked pork hanging dark from ceiling beams. Sacks of barley and rye piled beneath thick cloth coverings to discourage rats. Wheels of hard cheese aging quietly in the cold. A servant checks each barrel with the seriousness of a priest counting relics. Because this is treasure. Not jewelled crowns. Food. You walk slowly through the dim building while lantern light flickers across iron-bound casks and hanging herbs. Winter stores reveal the true heart of medieval life more honestly than feasts ever could. Rich nobles may enjoy spices and white bread, but even they fear empty granaries. A bad winter humbles everyone eventually. The steward explains how every season demands preparation months in advance. Fish salted before autumn storms, apples dried carefully beside low fires, cabbages packed into cool cellars, beans stored against mice, ale brewed before grain supplies shrink. Nothing survives winter accidentally. Near one wall, servants slice strips of smoked bacon while discussing dwindling oat supplies. Nearby, two women inspect onions for rot before the damage spreads through entire baskets. Medieval food storage requires constant vigilance. Mould, damp, rats, theft. insects, every winter danger waits patiently in the dark. Some swear placing sprigs of rowan above grain bins keeps evil spirits from spoiling the harvest. Others claim cats sleeping near flour sacks bring good fortune. No one can quite agree whether medieval storehouses rely more heavily on practical labour or cautious superstition. Probably both again. The steward leads you down narrow steps into the cellar beneath the manor house itself. Cold air settles thick underground. Rows of barrels disappear into shadow while candles sputter softly against stone walls wet with condensation. Wine for the lord. Ale for the household. Cider for servants. Vinegar for preserving vegetables. Everything measured carefully. You notice the finest goods remain locked behind iron grates, imported spices, white flour, dried figs, honey sealed in clay jars. Luxury requires protection. Meanwhile, barrels of rye and oats stand openly accessible because common food, though essential, attracts less envy. Above ground again, the kitchens prepare winter meals beside roaring hearths. Steam clouds the windows while cooks chop onions with terrifying speed. The menu tonight feels noticeably simpler than noble feasts earlier in your journey. Winter changes even aristocratic tables. Roasted meats become less frequent when fresh livestock must be preserved carefully. Root vegetables appear constantly now: turnips, carrots, parsnips. Salted foods dominate everything. The season narrows choices for rich and poor alike, though not equally. A kitchen maid hands you a slice of dried apple, while explaining how difficult late winter becomes if stores run low too early. The hungry months, she calls them quietly. That phrase lingers with you. Because winter hunger rarely arrives dramatically here. It creeps slowly. Bread grows smaller, ale weakens, pottage thins, salt pork disappears from stews 1 week and never quite returns. At the peasant cottages, families already count remaining cabbages nervously. At the manor, stewards count barrels. Different scales of worry. Same winter. Outside, labourers unload turnips from carts while stable boys haul firewood through thick mud. A thin cold wind sweeps across the fields carrying the smell of smoke and damp earth. Somewhere beyond the barns, pigs squeal loudly during feeding. Those pigs represent future survival more than present comfort. You follow the steward into another storage shed where grain waits beneath heavy cloth coverings. He kneels, scoops up a handful of wheat, and lets it spill slowly through his fingers. This, he says quietly, is peace. You understand him immediately. Grain means bread. Bread means calm villages. Empty granaries mean desperation. The dog wanders through the storehouse, hopefully searching for accidental sausage miracles. Sadly, security appears tight. As evening settles over the manor, supper gathers the household together in quieter fashion than the grand feast days before. Thick bean stew flavoured with smoked bacon, dark bread, ale, pickled cabbage sharp enough to wake your ancestors. Simple by noble standards, perhaps, but still far richer than many peasant tables through the hungry months ahead. You sit near the hearth, watching servants dry wet boots while outside the wind rattles softly against shutters. Conversation drifts toward weather signs and next year's planting. One old labourer predicts a mild spring because crows nested early. Another insists heavy fog means poor barley yields. Even now, it is hard to tell whether medieval farming depends more upon experience or hopeful guessing wrapped in folklore. The fire burns warmly, candles flicker low, and around you, from noble cellars to peasant rafters, medieval life continues orbiting one enormous invisible question. Will the food last until spring? Everything else feasts, spices, wine. Even status itself matters less once winter deepens and the storehouses begin slowly emptying into darkness. A week later, the winter sky finally clears into a cold, bright blue that makes every rooftop and frozen puddle shine beneath the morning sun. You travel once more toward the manor, where preparations for a feast day have transformed the quiet estate into a whirl of movement and smoke and shouting. Even from the outer fields, you can smell roasting meat. Servants hurry between kitchens and storehouses carrying baskets, barrels, folded linens, and enough bread to feed a small army or one particularly determined medieval wedding. Horses stamp impatiently beside the stables while carts arrive loaded with ale casks and firewood. Today the Lord hosts a feast following the Saints' Day celebrations. And unlike ordinary meals, feast days reveal something important about medieval food that you've only glimpsed so far. Abundance trickles downward. Not equally, not fairly, but noticeably. The great hall glows warmly by late afternoon. Fresh rushes cover the floor again, mixed with sweet herbs to disguise the smell of wet wool, and too many people gathered close together. Candles blaze along the high table. Musicians tune pipes and fiddles near the hearth, while servants arrange trenchers in long orderly rows. The dog circles beneath the tables, already preparing for what can only be described as professional opportunity. You settle among lesser guests while villagers gather cautiously near the lower benches. Feast days blur social boundaries slightly, though never entirely. Peasants may enter the hall for celebrations, but rank still determines where they sit, what they receive, and how quickly. Still, tonight even the lower tables feel richer than usual. White bread appears occasionally among darker loaves. Extra ale flows more freely. Bowls of thick stew contain actual visible meat rather than merely hopeful traces. For many poor villagers, feast days offer rare encounters with foods normally reserved for wealthier households. The musicians begin playing as the first platters emerge from the kitchens through clouds of fragrant steam. Roasted geese glazed with honey, beef stewed in ale, pies bursting with onions and herbs, wheels of cheese beside baskets overflowing with bread. Conversation rises immediately. Laughter echoes against the rafters. Children stare wide-eyed toward the high table where the grandest dishes appear beneath candlelight like visions from another world entirely. There sits the Lord's household surrounded by white manchets, imported wine, sugared almonds, saffron sauces, roasted swan, and delicate pastries shaped like flowers and animals. And below them, villagers clutch coarse bread thankfully while waiting to see how much abundance might drift downward tonight. Two worlds again, but closer now. The feast unfolds slowly through music, prayers, spilled ale, and endless movement from exhausted servants. Trenchers soak with rich gravy before being carried away and replaced. Bones accumulate beneath tables for waiting dogs. Candles drip beeswax onto polished holders while smoke curls lazily toward the dark beams overhead. You notice something fascinating tonight. Food travels through the hall almost like a map of medieval society. The finest cuts remain upstairs. Then come smaller portions for lesser nights. Then servants. Then labourers. Then scraps carried afterward to waiting poor outside the gates. Nothing moves upward. Everything flows down. A serving girl pauses near your bench balancing a tray of roasted capons and whispers that villagers always hope feast days end generously. Depends how much the Lord wants praising tomorrow, she mutters. Practical politics. Near the lower tables, peasants eat more richly tonight than usual. Beef stew thickened with barley, fresh cheese, soft wheat rolls mixed among the darker rye loaves. One old woman near the hearth closes her eyes briefly while tasting spiced gravy, as though memorizing it for future winters. You realize noble leftovers themselves can feel luxurious to people accustomed to cabbage broth. At the high table, however, the feast borders on theatrical. A giant pie arrives crowned with pastry birds. Sweet hypocras wine flavoured with cinnamon and cloves fills silver cups. Candied fruits gleam beside almonds imported through distant trade routes. The Lord laughs loudly while musicians play faster near the fire. No one can quite agree whether medieval feasts existed mainly for pleasure or for demonstrating power through excess. Perhaps there is little difference. Outside the hall doors, you notice shadows gathering near the kitchens as evening deepens. Beggars, widows, travellers too poor to enter the feast itself. They wait patiently in the cold because everyone knows what comes after great celebrations. Leftovers. And leftovers from noble halls can feed many people. Kitchen servants eventually emerge carrying baskets filled with soaked trenchers, meat scraps, crusts, and bones still heavy with marrow. The waiting crowd stirs instantly. Not chaos, more like practiced hunger. A monastery brother nearby supervises distribution calmly while muttering prayers beneath his breath. Children clutch warm bread with both hands. An old man wraps leftover pie crust carefully inside cloth for later. Inside the hall, musicians continue playing while wine spills freely across polished tables. Outside, a single softened trencher can feel like fortune. The contrast settles heavily in your chest tonight. Because the feast genuinely helps people, and yet it also reminds everyone exactly who controls abundance in the first place. A peasant beside you tears apart a soft wheat roll slowly, almost reverently. He says his children will remember tonight's meal for weeks. Meanwhile, a noble youth complains that the hypocras tastes weaker than last winter. Medieval life contains many forms of hunger. As the evening deepens, the hall grows warmer and louder. Faces flush red from firelight and ale. Musicians blur notes together happily. Servants move with exhausted determination, while dogs beneath the benches achieve astonishing levels of optimism. The dog accompanying you successfully steals an entire sausage at one point before disappearing triumphantly beneath the tablecloth. Honestly, someone should knight him. Near midnight, the feast finally begins winding down. Candles burn low, bones and crumbs litter the rushes. The richest guests drift upstairs wrapped in fur-lined cloaks, while servants scrape trenchers into baskets for redistribution. The hall after feasting feels strangely peaceful, like a battlefield fought entirely with gravy. You remain seated near the dying fire while villagers gather their remaining crusts carefully before stepping back into the freezing dark outside. Smoke lingers beneath the rafters. The smell of roasted meat still hangs heavy in the warm air. And slowly, watching leftovers pass from noble tables into peasant hands, you begin understanding something essential about medieval abundance. The rich eat first. The poor eat afterward. But sometimes, on rare, bright feast nights beneath candlelight and music, even crumbs from the high table can briefly make winter feel less cruel. The feast leaves the manor strangely quiet the following morning. Ash settles pale beneath the hearths. Half-burned candles lean crooked in their holders. Servants move through the hall with slow, exhausted steps, gathering bones, stained trenchers, spilled rushes, and abandoned cups sticky with wine. Outside, frost coats the courtyard again beneath a dim white dawn. You step carefully around sleeping dogs and snoring travellers while kitchen boys carry buckets toward the wells. The great hall still smells faintly of roasted meat and cloves, though underneath lingers the sharper scent of old ale and smoke soaked deep into the beams. Even celebrations eventually become chores in medieval life. In the kitchens, cooks already prepare simpler meals once more. Feast food disappears quickly. Daily survival returns immediately. Barley porridge bubbles beside black bread dough while servants scrape hardened grease from pans large enough to bathe sheep. One old cook yawns heavily and declares that noble appetites are the true reason monasteries invented prayer. You're not entirely certain that is historically accurate, but emotionally it feels correct. This morning, however, attention turns away from feasts and towards something equally important in medieval life. Health, or at least humanity's ongoing attempt to understand why stomachs behave so mysteriously after eating 3 pounds of roasted goose. Near the kitchen hearth, a local healer has arrived carrying baskets of herbs bundled in linen cloth. Villagers gather around her quietly seeking remedies for winter coughs, aching joints, poor digestion, and various complaints involving bad humours, which medieval medicine blames for nearly everything short of bad weather and difficult relatives. You follow curiously while she sorts dried plants across a wooden table. Sage, rue, mint, fennel, wormwood. The entire room fills with bitter, earthy smells. She explains that food and health remain deeply connected in medieval thinking. Every ingredient supposedly affects the balance of the body's humours: hot, cold, moist, dry. Rich meats heat the blood. Fish cools the body. Onions strengthen labourers. Pears after milk invite disaster for reasons no one seems eager to test personally. Some swear cabbage causes melancholy if eaten during rainstorms. Others insist garlic protects against plague, evil spirits, and disappointing husbands simultaneously. Even now, it is hard to tell whether medieval medicine functions more like science or deeply committed storytelling around vegetables. The healer hands a servant girl a pouch of thyme for chest sickness, while warning her not to drink cold ale afterward. Nearby, an old knight complains of stomach pain after last night's feast. The healer raises one eyebrow. How many capons? The knight suddenly studies the floor very carefully. In noble households especially, food becomes medicine as much as pleasure. Wealthy tables overflow not merely because nobles enjoy abundance, but because certain foods supposedly strengthen health and status alike. Spices warm the body. Sweet wines aid digestion. Sugar itself is often treated partly as medicine. Sugar. Medicine. Human beings truly will justify anything delicious eventually. You accompany the healer into the village later that afternoon, where winter smoke hangs low between cottages. Children chase one another through muddy lanes, while women hang damp laundry beside weak sunlight. The contrast with manor life feels immediate again. Here, illness often begins with hunger itself. Thin winter meals weaken bodies gradually. Damp cottages breed coughs. Hard labour bends backs and stiffens joints before middle age arrives. Peasant diets rely heavily on whatever survives winter storage: onions, cabbage, barley, dark bread. Still, folk knowledge thrives everywhere. A grandmother hangs garlic beside the doorway to keep sickness out. Another family burns rosemary branches because they believe pleasant smoke cleans bad air from the cottage. One shepherd carries a tiny saint's relic sewn inside his tunic to protect against fever. No one can quite agree whether these customs truly heal people, but nearly everyone practices them anyway. Inside one smoky cottage, you watch supper being prepared slowly over the hearth. Thin oat pottage tonight, a little leek, a little cabbage, nothing extravagant. Yet before serving, the woman cooking adds herbs carefully while whispering a brief prayer beneath her breath. Food and faith remain inseparable here. You ask quietly whether the herbs help. She shrugs. They help me hope. Perhaps that is enough. Meanwhile, back at the manor, nobles approach health from an entirely different angle. Wealthier households employ physicians trained in university theories from distant cities. These learned men study ancient texts, astrology, urine colours, bloodletting schedules, and complicated dietary balances. One physician insists noblemen should avoid excessive beef because it overheats the blood. The steward replies dryly that excessive beef appears unavoidable whenever the Lord hosts hunting guests. At supper that evening you sit once more between both worlds. The manor table serves roasted chicken with herb sauce, white bread, pears preserved in honey, and warm wine infused with cloves for healthy digestion. Conversation revolves around balancing humours during winter. Below stairs, servants eat cabbage stew thickened with yesterday's bread crusts while discussing which herbs stop coughing fastest. Both groups seek health through food, but one seeks refinement. The other seeks endurance. You notice something else too. Noble illnesses often come from excess. Peasant illnesses often come from scarcity. The healer herself seems aware of this contradiction. Later beside the hearth, she quietly tells you that wealthy stomachs suffer from too much richness, while poor stomachs suffer from too little nourishment. Either way, she sighs, someone blames the onions. Reasonable enough. The fire crackles low while outside the wind rattles shutters softly against the dark. The dog sleeps heavily near the kitchen door after what appears to have been another successful sausage-related crime. Candles burn down slowly, herbs dry above the hearth, and throughout manor and village alike, medieval people continue placing extraordinary faith in food, not only to satisfy hunger, but to cure sickness, protect the spirit, strengthen the blood, calm the heart, and perhaps persuade winter itself to loosen its grip for one more year. Because in this world, supper is never simply supper. It is remedy, warning, comfort, hope, and sometimes, when the night grows especially cold and uncertain beneath smoke-black rafters, a warm bowl of broth beside the fire may feel very close to a miracle indeed. Winter begins slowly loosening its grip upon the countryside as you leave the manor once more and follow the southern pilgrim road beneath a pale grey sky. Frost still clings stubbornly to the shaded ditches, but water now trickles beneath bridges instead of lying frozen beneath them. Birds return cautiously to the hedgerows. The air smells faintly of wet earth waking again. You travel beside merchants, wandering labourers, pilgrims wearing tin badges upon their cloaks, and one monk leading an extremely judgmental donkey. The dog follows too, naturally. At this point he feels less like a companion and more like an unofficial medieval tax on your journey. The road stretches muddy and uneven between fields where peasants already prepare for spring planting. Wooden ploughs creak through softened ground while smoke rises from distant cottages in soft morning columns. Everyone speaks now of seed grain, lambing season, and whether winter stores will last until fresh crops appear. The hungry months continue. You stop near midday beside a roadside shrine where travellers rest beneath bare trees. Someone has left wilted flowers beside the small carved saint while candles gutter weakly against the wind. Nearby, merchants unpack bread and onions from cloth bundles while a pilgrim warms his hands around a steaming cup of ale purchased from a passing cart. Roadside meals reveal medieval society in miniature. Simple, portable, unequal. A wealthy merchant spreads a linen cloth carefully across a fallen log before arranging white bread, smoked ham, soft cheese, dried figs, and a flask of wine. His servant wipes the knife clean after each slice as though performing surgery upon lunch itself. Meanwhile, two labourers nearby share coarse rye bread hard enough to threaten dental history. One rubs garlic directly onto the crust for flavour before dipping it into weak ale. Two worlds again. Always. You sit among the poorer travellers near a small fire where cabbage soup bubbles in an iron pot blackened by years of road soot. A widow travelling toward the abbey towns hands you a wooden bowl. Thin broth, barley, leek, tiny scraps of salted fish floating hopefully near the surface. It tastes honest. That is the strange word rising in your mind lately whenever peasant food appears. Honest. Nothing hidden beneath spices or sugar. No imported luxuries distracting from the reality of hunger and weather and labour. The widow beside the fire explains quietly that travellers often carry onions because they last well on the road and supposedly protect against bad air. Another pilgrim claims dried rosemary inside boots prevents blisters during long journeys. No one can quite agree whether medieval roads contain more mud or more superstition. Probably tide. Farther along the roadsides, a group of noble riders pauses briefly near the stream crossing. Their servants unload baskets immediately white manchettes wrapped in cloth, preserved fruits, sweet cakes dusted lightly with sugar, roasted chicken carried cold from yesterday's kitchens. Even travelling, wealth refuses simplicity. One young nobleman wrinkles his nose dramatically at the muddy conditions while eating spiced pastry. You suspect the mud remains emotionally unmoved by his criticism. The monk travelling with the donkey joins your fireside group eventually and shares hard cheese from a leather satchel. He explains that monasteries along major roads often provide bread and soup to pilgrims too poor to pay for inns. God travels hungry sometimes, he says quietly. The widow nods without looking up from the fire. As afternoon fades, the travellers continue onward through forests still bare from winter. The road narrows beneath tall dark trees where damp leaves soften every footstep. Ravens croak overhead, while distant church bells drift faintly through the woods from some unseen village beyond the hills. You eat again near dusk beside a roadside fire sheltered by stones. The wealthy merchant roasts sausages over careful coals while drinking wine from a silver cup. His servants unpack blankets and pastries beside the wagon. A physician travelling with him insists warm spiced wine protects against forest chills and wandering humours. Nearby, labourers share turnips roasted directly in ash. The difference could not appear clearer if someone painted it onto banners. And yet everyone around the fire tonight seeks the same basic comforts. Warmth, food, dry shelter, rest for aching feet. The medieval road humbles people eventually, though not equally. A pilgrim tells stories while darkness gathers slowly beneath the trees. He claims certain inns water their ale so heavily that customers wake thirstier than before. Another traveller insists he once saw a noble feast where peacocks were served with feathers reattached afterward for decoration. Those who tell the tale never fully agree whether such spectacles truly happened or whether hungry travellers simply enjoy imagining absurdly wealthy dinners while chewing onions beside muddy roads. Still, after all you have seen, you suspect medieval nobles absolutely would decorate food with unnecessary feathers if given the opportunity. The fire crackles softly. Night birds call somewhere beyond the trees. The dog sleeps beside the embers, clutching a stolen sausage with remarkable moral confidence. You look around the small roadside camp and realise something quietly important. Travel strips meals down to essentials. Even the wealthy must eventually eat cold meat beside muddy roads. Even peasants can briefly share warmth beside the same fire as merchants and monks. The differences remain enormous. Yes, white bread beside black rye, wine beside weak ale, sweet cakes beside boiled turnips. But beneath the dark forest canopy, everyone still reaches toward the same flames with cold hands. The stars emerge slowly overhead as the road settles into silence. Travellers wrap themselves in cloaks and wool blankets, while embers glow red against the night. Somewhere distant, wolves howl faintly across the hills. The widow beside the fire tears her final crust in half and hands part quietly to a younger pilgrim too tired to ask. No silver goblets, no saffron, no feast musicians. And yet in this small shared moment beside the roadside fire, with cabbage broth warming tired hands and smoke drifting softly into the dark branches above, you begin to understand that medieval food is not only about wealth or hunger. Sometimes it's simply about continuing onward together through the cold. At last, your road bends back toward the manor where this long winter journey first began. Evening settles softly across the countryside now, gentler than before. Snow has disappeared from the fields entirely, leaving behind dark, wet earth ready for spring ploughing. Thin mist gathers above the river banks while the first frogs begin calling somewhere among the reeds. The manor rises ahead beneath a fading gold sky, its windows glowing warmly against the coming dusk. Smoke drifts upward from the kitchens in quiet, familiar curls. Bells from the distant monastery roll slowly across the fields, softer now somehow, as though the whole medieval world has grown tired beside you. The dog trots faithfully at your side, carrying absolutely nothing for once, which feels suspicious. You pass peasant cottages where evening meals already simmer above hearth fires. Through open shutters you glimpse cabbage steaming in iron pots, dark bread cooling beside the coals, families gathered shoulder to shoulder after long days in wet fields. Children scrape bowls eagerly while old women mend clothing beside candlelight too precious to waste. Simple suppers? Steady suppers. Meals built from endurance more than abundance. Farther uphill, the manor kitchens prepare different evening fare entirely. You smell roasted poultry, fresh herbs, and wine warmed with cinnamon drifting through the cooling air. Servants hurry across the courtyard balancing trays beneath linen cloths, while stable boys carry firewood toward the great hall. Two worlds again. Always. And yet now, after so many roads and fires and winter nights, the difference feels quieter somehow. Less shocking. More human. Inside the great hall, candles glow softly against dark beams overhead. The feast crowds are gone. No musicians tonight. No towering pies or silver salt cellars displayed proudly beneath torchlight. Only a smaller household supper unfolding in calm, familiar rhythms. Nobles eat at the high table beneath beeswax candles. Servants move carefully through warm shadows carrying bread, broth, roasted meat, and wine. Below them, household workers gather nearer the hearth with bowls of pottage and dark ale. Outside these walls, peasants eat onions and barley beside smoky cottage fires. Inside, nobles break soft white bread with clean hands beside polished cups. And all evening long you find yourself thinking not about the differences anymore, but about the strange invisible thread connecting every table you have seen. Because whether food arrives on silver plates or in cracked wooden bowls, medieval life bends around the same quiet fears. Will the harvest hold? Will winter pass gently? Will the children eat enough? Will the stores survive until spring? You sit near the fire while servants lower candles one by one. The hall smells of wood smoke, damp wool, and warm bread. Somewhere above, rain begins lightly tapping against the shutters again, soft as fingertips against old oak. A steward nearby complains mildly that the wine shipment from the south arrived late this season. At the lower benches, a servant wraps leftover crusts carefully in cloth to carry home. The scale changes. The worries remain. No one can quite agree whether medieval people accepted these inequalities peacefully, or merely endured them because life itself already demanded so much energy. But after walking their muddy roads and sitting beside their fires, you begin understanding that survival leaves little room for perfect fairness. A peasant family treasures one strip of salted pork through winter. A noble household debates saffron quality beside candlelight. Yet both worlds still pause gratefully when fresh bread emerges warm from the oven. Both worlds still gather closer when winds rattle the shutters at night. Both worlds still fear hunger waiting quietly beyond the next failed harvest. The dog finally curls beside the hearth with a deep, satisfied sigh. Perhaps even he understands the journey is ending. The fire settles lower. Conversations soften. Candles burn shorter. And slowly the great hall grows quieter until only the small familiar sounds remain: crackling embers, distant rain, quiet footsteps crossing rush-covered floors, the low murmur of tired people easing towards sleep. You think back to everything you have tasted and smelled and seen. Dark rye bread hard as winter soil, soft white manchets warm from noble ovens, cabbage broth simmering endlessly above peasant fires, spiced wine glowing red beneath candlelight, salted fish in monastery kitchens, honey cakes at feast tables, alehouse stew shared among muddy travellers, and all of it, every loaf and onion and cup of ale, forming the shape of an entire world now fading slowly into darkness around you. The rain outside deepens gently. The bells sound once more across the distant fields. A servant covers the remaining bread with linen cloth for morning. Somewhere beyond the manor walls, villagers settle beneath wool blankets while embers glow red through cottage cracks. Somewhere upstairs, nobles sleep behind tapestries with full stomachs and heavy curtains against the draught. And beneath the same wet medieval sky, rich and poor alike drift towards sleep, carrying tomorrow's worries quietly into their dreams. The hall dims further. The fire becomes softer now, lower and redder, casting long, slow shadows across the stone floor. The warmth reaches your hands gently, your boots dry beside the hearth at last. The smell of smoke settles into everything: the beams overhead, the wool cloaks hanging by the wall, the old dog sleeping peacefully nearby. Outside, the rain washes softly over roads that will fill again tomorrow with merchants and pilgrims and farmers carrying onions, bread, salted fish, wine, hopes, fears, and all the ordinary hungers of medieval life. But tonight the roads are empty. Tonight the kitchens are quiet. Tonight the candles burn low and steady while the manor sleeps. And as the final embers sink slowly inward beneath silver ash, the great hall itself seems to breathe more softly around you, warm and dim and ancient, holding close the last lingering smells of bread and smoke and rain, while the long medieval night folds gently shut at last.